CIA is helping Ukraine strike Russian oil and energy targets while Kyiv's drones hit Russia's Shadow Fleet tankers, cutting Moscow's war revenue. President Trump says he is ready to give Ukraine security guarantees, but are they really worth it? And can U.S. behind-the-scenes support actually turn the tide of the war? According to the New York Times, CIA helped Ukraine plan and carry out drone strikes against Russian oil facilities, targeting one of Moscow's main sources of the war. The effort was largely secret and continued while other forms of U.S. support became uncertain. Times reports that U.S. intel officials shared information with Ukraine to help them hit critical parts of Russian oil refineries. These were not random strikes. Drones were aimed at specific equipment that is hard to replace and can shut down entire facilities. By mid-2025, strikes became more effective. Refineries were knocked offline for weeks at a time. U.S. intelligence assessments cited by the Times found that attacks cost Russia tens of millions of dollars a day. Oil exports are one of Russia's main sources of income. Hitting these targets put pressure on Moscow's ability to pay for the war. While weapons shipments and other military aid were delayed or paused, intel cooperation continued. According to the New York Times, CIA's role was largely protected from the political debates happening inside Washington. This created a split approach. Publicly, U.S. support appeared weaker. Privately, American intelligence was still helping Ukraine strike deep inside Russia. Meanwhile, as the New York Times details, Trump's administration treated military assistance as leverage rather than commitment. Aid was no longer guaranteed, it was conditional. Ukrainian officials were made to understand that continued support depended on their willingness to conduct negotiations. This is a sharp break from earlier U.S. policy. Previously, U.S. insisted that Ukraine alone would decide when to negotiate. Under Trump's reports, the pressure shifted away from Russia toward Ukraine. According to New York Times, U.S. officials pushed Ukrainian leaders to make concessions, including giving up territory and accepting long-term limits on Ukraine's security and alliance. Russia, meanwhile, faced little pressure. The imbalance was clear. While Ukraine was urged to compromise, Moscow's demands barely changed. The Times notes that Russian officials continue to insist on keeping occupied land and restricting Ukraine's future, confident that time and political division in Washington were on their side. The reporting also reveals deep confusion and split inside U.S. government. Military commanders and intel officials argued that weakening Ukraine would only strengthen Russia. Yet political positions and aligned with Trump questioned whether Ukraine was worth the cost at all. The result described by newspaper was a fractured policy. Covert intel operation continued behind the scenes while open military support wavered. Allies struggled to read Washington's intentions. Ukraine was forced to plan for the worst. Trump claimed he could personally broker peace with Vladimir Putin. But the New York Times reports that these efforts produced no major concessions from Russia. Instead, they raised false expectations while Ukraine paid the price of delay. Putin had little reason to rush. The Times makes clear that Russia's strategy benefited from U.S. hesitation far more than from Ukrainian compromise. The damage extended beyond the battlefield. European allies began preparing for a future in which U.S. leadership could no longer be assumed. Ukrainian officials, once confident in Washington's backing, began hedging and looking for alternatives. Trump did not officially abandon Ukraine, but as time shows, he did something nearly as harmful. He made American support unpredictable. The lesson of the Times reporting is stark. In war, uncertainty is a weakness. Meanwhile, a proposed U.S. security guarantees for Ukraine under President Trump would likely provide little real protection against Russian aggression, according to an opinion piece by Philip Gordon in the New York Times. Gordon, a Brookings Institution scholar and former U.S. official, argues that while U.S. and Ukrainian officials have discussed a framework in which Ukraine could cede parts of the Donbas in exchange for American guarantees, such promises would be largely symbolic and not backed by credible action. Quote, any security guarantee offered by President Trump would not be enough to stop Russia or ensure U.S. support in the future crisis, the Times reports. According to Gordon and the New York Times, these are several reasons. Reluctance to confront Russia. Trump has historically avoided direct confrontation with Moscow, often downplaying Russian military actions or framing Ukraine as responsible for the war. Reductions in support. The article notes that Trump has already reduced U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, showing and slowing down weapon deliveries. Alignment with Russian narratives also in place. Gordon writes that Trump has echoed or tolerated Russian talking points, including suggesting that Ukraine bears responsibility for the conflict, and economic engagements with Russia could be beneficial, according to Trump. These patterns would make it difficult for allies in Ukraine to trust any future guarantee. The Times also points to the Budapest Memorandum, in which US, UK and Russia pledged to guarantee Ukraine's security after it gave up nuclear weapons. That agreement failed to prevent Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its full-scale invasion in 2022. Also, according to these promises, Gordon writes that a new guarantee under Trump could repeat these mistakes, leaving Ukraine vulnerable while giving Moscow little incentive to compromise. The security guarantee discussed in negotiations would apply not only if Russia carried out a significant and sustained attack, according to the Times. Gordon warns that the wording is so vague that a president could easily refuse to respond. Past examples, including Trump's description of a Russian drone crossing into Poland, illustrate how such guarantees could be ignored or minimized in practice. Rather than rely on uncertain pledges, Gordon and the Times argue that Ukraine should focus on tangible measures to strengthen its defense. This includes also access to frozen Russian assets. More than $200 billion in Russian assets held by Western banks could be used to fund Ukraine. Major arms package, advanced weapons, including missiles, fighter jets, patrol air defense systems, and ammunition, control and strategic infrastructure, joint U.S.-Ukraine oversight of facilities like the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant could enhance both energy and security. These tangible assets, Gordon writes, would provide Ukraine with real tools to deter aggression. Unlike promises that may never be enforced, the Times piece warns that relying on a Trump security guarantee could be risky for Ukraine. If Kyiv were to make territorial concessions, it could weaken its position against Moscow without receiving meaningful protection. At the same time, the article highlights the broader strategic concern for U.S. allies may question Washington's reliability if guarantees are not credible, while adversaries like Russia may exploit such uncertainty. Gordon concludes that Ukraine should seek enforceable support rather than symbolic assurances. That's all for today. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and glory to Ukraine.